By the late 70s, the former Honeybourne line, which ran through the Cotswolds in the heart of England, seemed destined to be forgotten, following closure of the line by British Rail. Reclamation by nature was most likely, but the spectre of stretches of the track being irretrievably buried beneath new housing and industrial developments loomed large for this part of the Great Western Railway's Birmingham to Bristol route. The Honeybourne line ran between Honeybourne in Warwickshire and Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. The first section originally opened on the 1st of August 1906 to provide a quicker route for both passengers and freight between the Midlands and the South West. But in 1960, with few passengers in the largely rural area, local services were withdrawn, and one of the last Great Western Railway lines to open was downgraded to a diversionary passenger route and freight line. After the derailment of a goods train in 1976, British Rail planned to close the line, but a motivated group of local people fought to keep the route open. Their campaign failed, and so in 1977, BR pressed ahead with the closure of the line. Undaunted, the campaigners instead set about trying to preserve a section of the route as a heritage railway line. But despite negotiations being well underway, pleas to prevent British Rail lifting the tracks fell upon deaf ears. All seemed lost. With freshly bare track beds, missing platforms and derelict or demolished stations, it was difficult to imagine that the line could ever become operational again. But a growing army of determined volunteers pressed on with rebuilding the standard gauge line, rail by rail, sleeper by sleeper. And by 1984, 700 yards of track was ready for the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway's first passenger train. Today the scene is very different, with the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway operating between Toddington in the north of Gloucestershire and the spa town of Cheltenham to the south. Operating a busy timetable of steam and diesel locos, the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway carries more than 70,000 passengers between Toddington, Winchcombe, Gotherington and Cheltenham racecourse stations each year. The 10-mile former mainline route hugs the edge of the Cotswolds escarpment, conveying passengers on a 35-minute journey through glorious Cotswold countryside, with spectacular views across the Severn Vale and Golden Valley, to the Malvern Hills and Black Mountains of Wales beyond. The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway is one of the most progressive heritage railways in Britain, introducing many mainline railway techniques into the preservation world. But the volunteers of the new GWR have not only rebuilt the preserved line from a bare track bed upwards, but they operate their multi-million-pound railway without a single paid member of staff. In 1899, the Great Western Railway was granted an Act of Parliament permitting the construction of a railway between Honeybourne and Cheltenham, as well as the doubling of the single-track route from Stratford-upon-Avon to Honeybourne.
This line was built by the Great Western Railway and opened throughout in 1906. So it's just over 100 years old now. And it was built to allow the Great Western Railway to reach the South Wales coalfields and the West Country, where there was a very lucrative business for holiday traffic, of course, and compete with the Midland Railway, which already had a route from Bristol up to Birmingham.
Construction of the Honeybourne to Cheltenham section of the line began in November 1902. But exactly a year later, on Friday the 13th, disaster struck. The 15-arch Stanway Viaduct, located just north of Toddington, partially collapsed.
This one's on a slight curve and a slight gradient, and while it was being built in 1903, most of the work had been done, and there was a steam crane on the top deck of the viaduct, and they were taking out the wooden arches that make the formers over which the brickwork is laid, and then when the mortar is set, the timber formers are taken out. It was a filthy day, pouring with rain. The chap in the crane suddenly felt the earth move, literally, and the arch that that his crane was standing on collapsed. He leapt for his life and grabbed the nearest thing that he could, which was a water pipe running along the top of the deck. To his horror, he found himself suspended 50 feet above the air. And then the water pipe broke and he fell down onto the rubble underneath where the arch had collapsed. He was dragged away from the rubble, and because it was pouring with rain, they put him underneath the next arch.
Unfortunately, the second arch also collapsed, proving fatal for the crane driver. The cause of the accident was never properly established, but it was thought a combination of lime mortar, poor weather, and removing the formers out of the arches a little too soon all played a part in the disaster. The first section of the line opened between Honeybourne and Broadway on the 1st of August 1904. And once the viaduct had been completed, the line to Toddington opened 4 months later. In February the following year, Winchcombe station opened, with Bishop's Cleeve and Laverton Halt coming into use later in the year, and the final section to Cheltenham opening in the middle of 1906.
The line is known locally as the Honeybourne line. It was always known as the Honeybourne line because the local train services used to go to Honeybourne Junction.
Use of the line peaked during the 1930s when, in addition to the local passenger services and freight traffic, up to 12 summer Saturday expresses used the line in each direction.
It carried a lot of heavy freight traffic, as you might expect, serving the steelworks and the coalfields of South Wales. And of course it served the fruit traffic and the agricultural produce that grew in the Vale of Evesham.
But by the early 1940s, the drop in demand for rail freight transportation had begun to take its toll, with more and more goods instead being transported by road. Gotherington was the first station on the Honeybourne line to succumb to rationalisation, when the station was closed to goods traffic and reduced to halt status on the 1st of January 1941. 8 years later, Gotherington signal box was decommissioned and the station closed completely in June 1955. But local passenger services between Cheltenham and Honeybourne were underutilised and making a loss.
And by 1960, the local stations on the line had all closed, with the exception of Cheltenham Racecourse station.
British Railways officially closed the stations to passengers on the 7th of March 1960.
When passenger traffic ceased, they'd taken down all the platforms of stations and things.
British Railways demolished most of the stations over the years.
And with them, the final remnants of the GWR local passenger services between Cheltenham and Honeybourne were gone. The stations, however, left one legacy. Great Corsican pine trees mark the sites of former stations along the route to this day. After the introduction of high-speed passenger services between Bristol and Birmingham on the old Midland Railway Birmingham to Gloucester line, the former GWR line could no longer compete. In 1968, timetabled through passenger trains were withdrawn, The line was expected to close and proposals were made to BR by the newly formed Stratford-upon-Avon Transport Action Committee to preserve the Honeybourne line. But instead, British Rail decided to keep the line open, but with the route downgraded.
Although it was still useful as a diversionary route in British Railways days, where trains were diverted from the main Midland line, and it was also still heavily used for freight traffic.
But on the 25th of August 1976, the fate of the Honeybourne line was sealed when freight traffic came to an abrupt end with the derailment of a Totten to Seven Tunnel Junction freight train just outside Winchcombe station near the B4362 road bridge.
An empty iron ore train derailed at Winchcombe, and the wagons all came off the line and they did an awful lot of damage to the track. A couple of wagons ended up in the road at Winchcombe, and it was a real mess.
Within about 3 weeks they had a new line laid, but nobody had told British Rail because they had actually announced they were going to close the line, using the derailment as an excuse.
BR announced the closure date of the Cheltenham to Honeybourne line as the 1st of November 1976. Except some local residents had other ideas.
Two people wrote to the local newspaper, a Derek Newsham and a Graham Newbury, and they said, "This is terrible, you know, it's a main line, it should be kept open." And they called a public meeting.
Held at Willasey Village Hall on the 18th of August 1976, between 40 and 50 people attended. By the end of the night, the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway Society had been launched.
We'd been formed as a society to save the line, to get BR to reoperate it.
Tim Baisley became one of the first members of the new committee.
I started as publicity officer, which was basically arranging meetings and generally getting the word across to the public. We held a lot of local meetings at different villages and towns, where we sort of went along and addressed them and gave talks about what was involved and encouraged support. And we ran a lot of rail trips. We ran rail trips all over the country, to York and everywhere where there's a rail centre. And that got a tremendous amount of support, and it raised a fair bit of funds too. And within the first 3 months, we got about 400 members of the society, which was fantastic.
Following more campaigning and not long after a name change to the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway Trust in October 1977, the rapidly expanding group achieved a partial success.
BR said yes, they were going to keep it, but they weren't going to run trains on it.
For 2 years, the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway Trust and BR talked. As it became clear that British Rail would not be reopening the line, the focus of the discussions moved instead towards purchasing the line. But BR maintained that the route was not for sale.
And then in 1979, they said they were going to lift the track because it was needed elsewhere. In fact, it was scrapped, so I mean that was a total untruth.
That July, BR began lifting the track. By June 1980, British Rail announced a change of plan. They were going to dispose of the line.
Up until then, BR had said they'd keep the permanent way, and in 1980 they said they didn't have any future use for it, which is somewhat strange because this was the Great Western Main Line from Birmingham to Bristol. And so we were then left with the choice of either packing up or trying to actually buy the line and run it as a steam railway. So we chose the latter.
The group determined to keep it open became a group determined to rescue it and reopen it.
The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway Trust began serious negotiations to purchase as much as possible of the permanent way. And 6 months later, in January 1981, the Trust reached agreement with the British Railways Property Board.
Originally we were going to buy 25 miles, which was from Cheltenham to Stratford, and we negotiated a price of £25,000.
The Trust would purchase the redundant trackbed from the northern edge of Cheltenham to Honeybourne, and from Long Marston to just south of Stratford-upon-Avon.
But then we had to actually buy the line from British Rail. To do that we had to get a light railway order.
Parliamentary agents were instructed to apply for a light railway order to ensure that passenger operations could begin at the earliest opportunity.
When we went to do the light railway order, we were told 25 miles was too long for a company that hadn't even got a run a train, let alone anything else. But they would accept 15 miles, which was Cheltenham to Broadway.
So on the 24th of February, the British Railways Property Board agreed to sell the section from the Cheltenham borough boundary at Pittville to the first overbridge north of Broadway, a total of 14.5 miles for £15,000.
Basically, it's £1,000 a mile. We've been incredibly lucky. We were in the right place at the right time. I mean, the price even then was a steal at £15,000. But British Rail wanted to get rid of its liabilities because it's responsible for all the structures, all the bridges over, bridges under, and they can cost a hell of a lot to maintain.
The group would soon be responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of 28 rail overbridges, 12 rail underbridges, 36 culverts, 2 tunnels and a viaduct.
We got everything within the outer fences. We got all the yards. We got all the buildings that remained, and there weren't that many that remained. A station building at Toddington, a goods shed and a signal box. At Winchcombe you had just the goods shed. Station, signal box totally demolished. And at Cheltenham racecourse you still had the platforms which were there. To them it was a good deal. To us it was a good deal.
Between Cheltenham and Honeybourne, most of the goods yards had either been sold off or were leased to outside bodies. That only left Toddington. An interim lease for the yard and part of the trackbed was signed on the 24th of March 1981, and the first group of would-be rail operators moved into Toddington 4 days later. Geoffrey White saw an advert in his local paper looking for volunteers and remembers those early days.
There was nothing on this railway whatsoever, no track, nothing, not a bit of track anywhere. There wasn't when I came. The signal box was in a mess. The station was virtually falling down. There was no platforms, like, you know, they had to rebuild everything virtually.
The station building remarkably still remained, although the platforms had gone, and the signal box building still remained, although the signal levers and the lever frame had disappeared.
People turned their hands to whatever needed doing. Brambles were hacked down and weeds attacked. Also, a start was made on site clearance and restoration of the station buildings, which had been used as storage by the local garden centre. Soon, Toddington's station and yard was a hive of activity, as volunteers pitched in with track laying and restoration as directed by the chairman, Tim Baisley.
And in the first few years I was actually almost full-time as operations manager.
In the beginning, the enthusiastic band of willing helpers was not organised into specific departments. Instead, they were directed towards whatever was most urgently needed. Ivor Dixon was another early volunteer.
Well, I came down to the site wondering what I could do, as I'd never worked on a preserved railway before, and went into the operations office, and they asked me if I could drive a JCB, and I said yes I could, and they said right, get down the yard there's a JCB without a driver on it, get and drive it, and that was my introduction to the permanent way. Fell into it more than anything, yes.
The 2 main and bay platforms at Toddington had been removed, so work also began rebuilding number 1 platform.
The platform edging slabs had all been cut away and taken away. Obviously it was a freight route once passengers finished, so they didn't need the platforms anymore, so they cut them all back.
Track had to be laid in order to accept rolling stock for restoration. The volunteers were lucky. Royal Engineers from the nearby Long Marston camp volunteered to level the track bed with one of their graders, making the task of track laying for the novices so much easier. But there was no money to buy even the most basic tools. Hammers, spanners and jacks were either donated by volunteers or scrounged from wherever they were to be found. The volunteers just had to make do. Helpers washed their hands in icy puddles in Toddington Yard and enjoyed on-site catering in a caravan where, once served at one end, diners walked to a table at the other end, only to find the caravan tipped up. Materials such as rails and sleepers were sourced for little or no money too, and the initial lengths of track had to be laid by hand.
There was a lot of hard work went in those early years. We didn't have the mechanical means that we have now. Obviously things have improved over the years, and it was very labour intensive in those days.
Dragging a 60-foot rail across what is now Toddington Car Park took 16 men, and 22 men were needed to drag a crossing or frog for a point. Glyn Cornish is a member of the Permanent Way team.
You start off by laying the track down and making sure that you've got the angle on it that you want. You then screw that down. You then go to the other side and you get a gauge to make sure you've got 4 foot 8.5, and you then screw the other track down. They're all fixed by metal keys which are fixed between the rail and the chair to make sure it doesn't move. So once the rail's been put down, join up the rails with fish plates and then put the keys in, and that's the job done.
First year we laid this stretch of track, literally down here, alongside the goods shed. It went to more or less where I'm standing, went back to the end of the goods shed, and we laid this stretch and then another stretch next to it.
Just 8 short weeks after signing the lease, enough track had been laid to receive the first items of rolling stock on the 30th of May 1981.
We put some galvanised steel panels around it, and that's where our first locomotives went. So that was our very, very first thing, was to lay these lines, bring in some locomotives and stick them inside this compound. Compound didn't last very long. We've never had any serious problems with vandalism or whatever else here. Then very slowly we extended the line down south. The first length of the line we opened was the first bridge south, which is just about half a mile down.
Early on, the members decided not to overstretch the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway financially, so money was tight to begin with. Volunteers scoured the barren trackbed for anything they might be able to reuse, such as old bolts and chairs, taking rusted up fishplate bolts and nuts home to try and free them up. The volunteers never dreamed that one day they would be able to buy new rails or bolts.
We consciously took that decision that we wouldn't put the railway into hock, and we would take it slowly in those initial years. There were a couple of people who helped in the first place, initial members of the railway, one of which is still part of the railway, and we managed to get a small loan from the bank. It was only a small loan, and they gave us a small overdraft as a facility as well, and very quickly we managed to pay the loan off, and gradually we didn't use the overdraft anymore. But we, unlike some railways, we didn't put the railway into hock with the banks for a large loan.
But the trust urgently needed to raise substantial funds to purchase, rebuild and operate the railway. It was agreed that a public limited company would be floated to raise the necessary capital.
And it had to be a public company rather than a limited company, again because of the scale we were proposing. I mean, it wasn't just a question of buying the line. You also have to buy rail, you have to buy rolling stock, you have to buy locomotives or whatever else. And a share issue was a relatively easy way to do it. There wasn't really an alternative. We needed large chunks of money.
The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Steam Railway plc was floated and the share prospectus issued on the 8th of August 1981. With an authorised share capital of £400,000, a daunting minimum of £50,000 for the share issue had to be raised within the statutory 40 days. A 24-hour sponsored track lay was held over the weekend of the 29th and 30th of August. 269 yards of track were laid and £600 was raised, but it was a drop in the ocean. They had just a few weeks left to reach their £50,000 target. Incredibly, the company managed to raise a mammoth £73,310 by their deadline of the 16th of September.
I actually floated the company and I was its first chairman.
The decision was made that the board of directors should be working volunteers on the railway, a principle that remains in place today, with directors down holes, up signal posts, laying track, erecting buildings, crawling round locos, or working in the ticket office. In December '81, a new lease was signed providing the new GWR with greater access to the yard at Toddington. But the railway still had a long way to go.
We couldn't do anything until the basically light railway had come through and we actually owned the track.
By the beginning of 1982, the momentum was waning and it seemed nothing could be done to halt the decline. Nevertheless, the next task was to decide which direction the railway should head first.
That involved quite a bit of argument. We started at Toddington because it's a logical place. We could either go north or south. I mean, that was the two total choices we had. A lot of people wanted to go north because that's where Broadway is. Broadway is about 4.5 miles from Toddington. It's a very popular tourist village, and they thought that would be the place where we get most custom. I thought very strongly that we should go towards Cheltenham. Cheltenham calls itself the centre for the Cotswolds. A lot of people come to Cheltenham and then they spread out from there. They go to lots of places around. Cheltenham's a fairly big population area. And immediately south we had Winchcombe, which was 2.5 miles, so we could actually get to Winchcombe quicker and easier than we could to Broadway. So we decided to go first for Winchcombe and then reassess.
That summer, the lease was extended to enable potentially 1,000 yards of running line to be laid. Rolling stock continued to arrive, so new sidings were rapidly laid. The sponsored track lay returned in the August, and 390 yards of track were laid. But still, without motorised tools, everything had to be done by hand. But the P-Way gang still managed to take the track to just south of Didbrook Bridge. The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Steam Railway plc was ready to make the formal application for the light railway order. Official notices were published, giving any objectors the opportunity to come forward. At the end of the notice period in December 1982, 5 official objections had been made. These were from the Gloucestershire County Council, Hereford and Worcester County Council, Severn Trent Water Authority, the Gas Council, and a private householder in Cheltenham. The Water Company and the Gas Council soon withdrew their objections when safeguards were written into the proposed light railway order. But the negotiations with the 2 county councils had to overcome problems that might arise in the future if the private GWR plc folded. January 1983 brought a new yardmate for the GWR. The Doughty Railway Preservation Society took up residence at the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway's site, bringing their large collection of standard gauge equipment with them. The Doughty Group decided to focus upon their 2-foot narrow gauge line, so the GWR inherited their standard gauge equipment, including their shed. 2 train operations required the use of both platforms at Toddington, so a passenger footbridge was needed. Gloucester City Council donated an ex-Midland Railway bridge that once crossed a rail link at Gloucester Docks, but was then left standing without purpose in Gloucester Park. At long last, agreement was finally reached with the 2 county councils, enabling the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Light Railway order, permitting the company to relay the line between Broadway and Cheltenham to be granted on the 24th of December 1983.
Once we got the light rail order and then able to actually complete the purchase from BR, that's when the line actually belonged to us. Up until that time we'd been leasing Toddington Yard from the British Rail. And so we couldn't actually run any trains until we'd actually bought the line.
Steam passenger services were scheduled to begin at Easter 1984.
Effectively, although we're a steam railway and a private railway, we still run under exactly the same terms and conditions as the big railway that you can go on. And we have to be approved by the rail inspector, or what was the rail inspector at that point in time. And they won't let you do 100 yards and come and get it approved. Basically, you have to do a significant chunk. Get it approved, so an inspector comes down and inspects and passes, then you go on and on.
Even though the destination for their push-pull train service could be measured in yards, the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway still had to provide an operational signal box to control the sidings to platform points. Although still standing, Toddington signal box had been heavily vandalised and was missing the vital lever frame. The resourceful signal and telegraph team managed to salvage a replacement lever frame from Earlswood box on the Stratford to Tyldesley line and completed the signal box refurbishment within a very short time. But money remained tight. The carriage and wagon department had no funds or facilities to begin with.
And all they did really was to get a couple of carriages from a scrapyard and clean them really. They were just cleaned, and they were just painted externally by somebody putting a ladder at the side and just painting them, and they were just swept out and washed out.
The very first coach, painted in chocolate and cream colours with Dulux paint, was only painted on one side, as passengers never saw the other side. On the 21st of March 1984, the Railway Inspectorate gave initial clearance for the operation of a two-coach push and pull train over a quarter-of-a-mile section of track.
So our first thing that was passed by the Railway Inspectorate was down to Didbrook 1, the first bridge, which is about half a mile, and that we were allowed to push and pull. So effectively you have an engine on one end, go down, and then it propels back.
On Easter Sunday 1984, the then Secretary of State for Transport and local resident Nicholas Ridley cut the tape at Toddington Station, and the first train, carrying a somewhat inappropriate headboard celebrating the 22nd year of the Doughty Railway Society, departed on its short journey.
The first train ran comprising a tiny tank engine which used to shunt wagons at Cadbury's chocolate factory in Birmingham, running over 700 yards of track from Toddington.
Once the Doughty Railway Preservation Society's standard gauge locomotive, the 1925-built Avonside 040 saddle tank, number 1977, called Cadbury Bourneville No. 1, had come from Cadbury's chocolate factory at Bourneville. Over 4,000 visitors were attracted over the first 3 weekends of operation. And in total, during the 26 operating days that season, 6,526 tickets were sold. The GWR volunteers were finally operating a railway, but they urgently needed footplate crew.
The first training was to get people trained up as drivers. So they learnt how to be firemen, but in practice they didn't even fire, they went straight on to being drivers.
Fortunately, Geoffrey White, who joined British Railways in 1953, had considerable firing and driving experience and was able to take on the role of instructor.
And of course some of the people who was working with me, I started teaching them in tea breaks, like in dinner breaks, little things, and telling them little things, because there was no railway then, like nothing. And that's how I started teaching them, like, and that was, then I taught the first half a dozen drivers and firemen. That was way back in 1982, 3, 4, 5, you know.
Nowadays, the training process is stricter with far more rules and regulations to abide by. Also, because would-be drivers must work their way up from cleaner to fireman and then driver, the training process takes many years, which causes a recruitment headache for both Geoffrey and the railway.
Because we're trying to get 25 crews, you know, but we've got a lot of old staff on our railway, and you know, and you teach a young bloke how to drive, and the same year an old one packs up, so the figures don't seem to go on very fast.
Everyone has to start off at the lowest rank as a cleaner.
Most of the cleaners will be doing at least 12 months, 18 months, but they do get a ride on the engine, you know. They come in the morning and help clean the engine, and then the driver will give them one ride up and down as a rule, and then they go into classroom.
Daniel Wick has been a junior volunteer for a year and a half and is already gaining experience in the locomotive department.
Well, I just clean all the engines, help preparation, and do all those sort of things. You have to be 18 to be a fireman and 25 to be a driver. It's just fun, and you sometimes get rides and everything. It's all fun, and you learn a lot about stuff that you wouldn't normally know about.
The next stage is gaining experience as a fireman, which Ben Everson has been doing for a while.
I've been volunteering down on the railway probably about 6 years now, but I've been a fireman for about 4 of those. It started as cleaning, just came and cleaned the engines in the morning, made them fit for duty, and then sort of progressed up the ladder from there, really.
Anyone aspiring to become a driver has to first work extremely hard as a fireman, doing a physically demanding job in sweltering temperatures.
It's great just pootling up and down here, you know, 25 miles an hour, enjoying the beautiful scenery that we've got. We're very lucky, really. It's not as easy as it sounds, though.
Paul Stratford did not initially volunteer to become a driver.
Well, when I first came down here, I was involved in the restoration of a locomotive. So I was pushed onto the fireman training, and so I've passed out as a fireman now. I've been a fireman for 3 years, and I've been elected to go forward for driver training now. But the training here is very good, and we've got some first-class instructors. Some of them are ex-British Railways drivers and firemen, so they did it for a living years ago, and they're willing to pass on all their skills.
Once the driver trainees are ready for passing out, they then fall under the watchful eye of Chris Irving, who's the GWR's footplate inspector for the final training period.
But now we're given pupils who are ready for passing out, and you get a lot of satisfaction seeing them go forward, particularly if you've known them from when they first joined the railway.
Today at Toddington, the scene is very different. The busy country station, nestling in the Cotswolds, operates with 2 platforms, a booking office, waiting rooms and a busy shop. In the yard, the sheds and sidings bustle with activity. The catering building, a large old sectional wooden building, was recovered from Harvington near Evesham and brought to Toddington, where it was rebuilt on a new concrete base. Opening to the general public on the 29th of March 1987, the flag and whistle blends in so well that it looks like it's always been part of the vista at Toddington. One of the more recent additions in 2002 was a new locomotive shed. The railway benefited from an unexpected gift by a Mr. David Page that enabled the building of the much-needed and long-awaited engine shed. The 4-road shed, called the David Page Locomotive Shed, really helped to transform the storage and working conditions for the locomotive department. Virtually all of the locomotives on the line, with one exception, are privately owned, and the railway hires them. The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway pays a steaming fee every time a locomotive runs, and also replaces the consumables, such as fire bars. 4 Mark Hall, a modified hall class, is in regular service on the line under such a contract. One of the larger locomotives, number 7903, 4 Mark Hall, is a Swindon-built loco which was completed in 1949. Along with other restoration volunteers from the 4 Mark Hall Restoration Trust, John Cruxon has lavished many years of attention on this locomotive.
Well, I've been involved with 4 Mark right from the beginning, and we bought her and actually brought her out of Barry in June 1981. We took her to Swindon Works for 1 day as an open day, and then transported her to the Swindon and Cricklade Railway at Swindon, and there she sat for the next 20 odd years whilst we carried out a full restoration back to full working order.
4 Mark Hall returned to steam in September 2003 and arrived at the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway in May 2004.
Since she's been working reliably, so perhaps we haven't done such a bad job.
John still derives a lot of satisfaction from trips on the footplate of 4 Mark Hall.
On a nice day, you go trundling down the line with the engine. It gives you that nice feeling, think, well, after all those years, you know, in the winter, in the summer, in the rain, in the dry, you have a nice ride on that and a good day, and it just pays back big time. It makes all the hard work worthwhile.
Back in the mid-80s, the Permanent Way Department pressed onwards, and by the beginning of the 1985 season, the track was extended further.
And then during the close season, they extended it another half a mile to Didbrook 2.
When the 1986 operating season began, the running line terminated at Didbrook No. 2 Bridge, and the return fare was 70 pence. But with the extension of the operational track to New Farmers Bridge at Hales Abbey on the 28th of June, the running line virtually doubled in length to 1.5 miles, enabling a fare rise to £1.
We could still push and pull to there, and that was the limit we were allowed to push and pull.
But when we got to there, the inspector says you're not going to push and pull any farther, you've got to get down to Winchcombe and then you can do the 3 miles like.
The Permanent Way team pushed onwards, but then disaster struck.
We were held up when we got to Hales because we had a crawler crane that broke down on the track bed there. We used to lay the panels of track with it, and unfortunately it took us quite a while to source spares for it, as it was an old machine.
Work could not progress until the crane was removed. but it took so long that it was becoming a long-standing joke.
The story was that, oh dear, we'll never get past Hales. It is a defeatist attitude, but in those days we had no money, and it was a case of borrow or beg or you know, whatever.
After that, we went on directly to Winchcombe. I think my proudest moment was when we got into Winchcombe station.
6 years to the month after taking over the lease, the line reached Winchcombe in 1987. The first steam train for 27 years, a 5-coach VIP press special hauled by Bagnall number 2655, Byfield number 2, arrived at the station on the 8th of March.
Winchcombe, again, there was nothing there when the railway reached there.
No platforms, no station or whatever else at Winchcombe. The very first thing we had to do was to build a platform.
The 2 main and 2 bay platforms at Winchcombe needed rebuilding. The volunteers had to lay a run-round loop to enable the locomotive to pull the train back to Toddington.
Everybody was happy to hook off, run round and pull the train back again, like, you know, and we got a lot of people and all. Got a lot of people, yeah, we done quite well. And that was it, and then of course we started getting more engines coming then.
And we were using very small locomotives which need coaling every time, and there was lots of short runs, and it was quite hard work in those days.
And then we had to build a signal box, which came from Birmingham.
Purchased in 1986 for £120 from British Rail, the signal box was formerly located at Hall Green near Tyseley. Painstakingly dismantled and rebuilt brick by volunteers, the Winchcombe signal box was completed by 1987.
We rebuilt Winchcombe station building by bringing one from Troy in Monmouth, Old Troy Station, and it does look the part. But that was literally taken down brick by brick, well, not by brick, stone by stone, and rebuilt at Winchcombe.
And of course, to look at it today, it looks as if it's been there forever, but ironically, the station building's a lot older than this railway, because the station building was built in about 1860, whereas this line opened in 1907.
The GWR's chairman, Malcolm Temple, discovered he had a connection to the station building too.
As a child, I used to have to travel regularly to school, and that travel was in South Wales to Monmouth, to a station called Monmouth Troy. For many years, I walked through this station every school day.
Winchcombe Station was officially opened by John Slatter, chairman of Winchcombe Council, and on the 2nd of August 1987, the first public train service arrived at Winchcombe Station. It was a momentous occasion for the volunteers, and a tangible milestone in the push to Cheltenham.
And I can remember a very proud moment of standing back on the road and seeing an engine and 2 carriages coming in, and it stopped over the bridge and everybody was waving. That was a big moment.
The longer journey to Winchcombe meant that Cadbury-Bourneville No. 1 was too small for the now heavily loaded trains. So in July 1988, the GWR introduced their first mainline locomotive, number 7752. Although the up platform at Winchcombe only opened in 1998, the railway had the foresight to install a station footbridge early on. Larger than the original, extensive work was required to provide suitable foundations. The bridge, previously located near Swansea, became redundant and was offered to the railway. Originally a straight bridge, considerable work was needed to modify it into the necessary U-shaped configuration. By May 1989, the points for the run-round loop at Winchcombe were moved to the present position in preparation for 2-train operation. The need for signalling between Winchcombe and Toddington became more urgent, but poor and conflicting professional advice delayed the signalling work until finally work progressed in 1995. The signalling was eventually commissioned in March 1997, allowing a much more ambitious timetable to be run on a regular basis. Chris Hayes is a signalman at Toddington.
We have 3 signal boxes on the line here at Toddington, Winchcombe and Cheltenham. Cheltenham is the simplest box, so that's what trainees tend to learn first. Toddington is really the next box, and then Winchcombe is the most senior box, if you like. The main reason for that is at Winchcombe you're working with 2 other signal boxes. On this railway at the moment today we're running what's called electric key token. So we have token instruments between this box Toddington and Winchcombe, which is the next box down the line. What that means is that in order for a train to leave here to proceed towards Winchcombe, they need to have the token. I can only get the token with Winchcombe's permission, and the machines are designed in such a way we can only ever have 1 token at one time. Because there's only 1 token, as long as the driver's got that in his cab, he knows that, that he's the only train on the line.
One of the few buildings remaining at Winchcombe when the GWR took over, the goods shed became the new headquarters of the carriage and wagon department. After a year of work making the building usable, on the 22nd of January 1989, the first carriage entered the newly restored shed. It was a long way from the C&W's humble beginnings when all carriage repair work had taken place in the open at Toddington. The work then was undertaken from a platform. Ladders or boxes and Dulux paint was the order of the day. Even so, all work still had to be done with handheld electric tools and the odd standing drilling machine and trolley.
We had virtually nothing, just a shell of a building and about 2 or 3 people, and now we've seen it develop to what it is now. We've got over 30, 35 volunteers and a fully operational workshop capable of turning out some really well-produced vehicles. We're responsible for the overhaul, maintenance, refurbishment of all the carriages and wagons on the railway. So we've got about 25 carriages operational, and my responsibility overall is to make sure that they're available for service as and when required.
In the early days, a gang worked each Wednesday, which in those days was still a half day for many people, and Saturday. One group dealt with the day-to-day maintenance when the stock was running. Another group undertook the carriage restoration.
Because a lot of the carriages we start with are scrap. They come from scrap yards, you see, so we've had to rebuild them. We have to get everything working. We have to make sure mechanically they're sound. We have to overhaul the bogies, the electrics, the plumbing, the lights, all that sort of thing. Make sure all the doors work, make sure they're mechanically safe, and make sure that internally they're in good condition for all the passengers. But one of the nice things about doing this, of course, is that we can spend 12 months doing this coach, but then we're able to travel it. And you see the public travelling it, and the real satisfaction is actually seeing it in use. So it's not a museum piece.
The Permanent Way team were ready to continue onwards towards Cheltenham, but their next milestone was quite a challenge.
Decided, well, we might as well go on through the tunnel because that's a big tourist attraction.
First objective was to get to the other side of the tunnel. That proved very interesting, going through the tunnel. No one had ever worked in a tunnel before. We actually had the help of the Mid-Hants Railways to put the track through the tunnel.
Track was laid through the 693-yard Great Tunnel in a 24-hour track lay in just one April weekend. The tunnel is supposedly haunted by the foreman of a group of gangers who were working in the tunnel in the 1920s, and they stepped out of the way of a train coming along one track, not realizing that the train had entered the tunnel in the opposite direction. The foreman realized what was happening, managed to push his colleagues out of the way, but was killed himself. And to this day, he haunts the tunnel, warning people of oncoming trains.
And then we went through the tunnel to a place called Gretton, I think it was called, Gretton Meadows.
The line officially reopened to Gretton on the 27th of May 1990. The extension was now 4¼ miles from Toddington. That October, the Autumn Gala became a major turning point. With 3 Great Western engines on the line, the Autumn Steam Extravaganza promised to be the biggest event to date on the railway. But when negotiations to bring record breaker number 3440 City of Truro to Toddington from the National Railway Museum was successfully concluded, the event became the ultimate Great Western Weekend, drawing 5,500 visitors. The general public were well and truly aware of the Gloucestershire and Warwickshire Railway. In January 1993, a new source of revenue came online when firing and driving courses were introduced using Bagnall Byfield No. 2. And later in the year, another money spinner, an on-train buffet service, was introduced. The star of the 1993 season was, without doubt, a visit by BR number 60103, or LNER number 4472, the Flying Scotsman, when the famous locomotive visited for a 6-week stay that September. Ivor Dixon and the Permanent Way team continued laying track towards Cheltenham Racecourse, reaching the 5-mile mark at Far Stanley in 1994.
We decided that we would put a run-round loop in at Far Stanley, which is halfway to Godrington from Winchcombe, and we did that initially, and until that allowed us then to run trains to there until we got to Godrington. Once we got to Godrington, we took the run-round loop out at Far Stanley and were able to run to Godrington.
To celebrate the 30th anniversary of the last steam-hauled passenger train to run on the line, Clun Castle, that very same loco, visited the GWR. The additional 1.5-mile extension to Gotherington took the line to a permanent loop built just beyond the privately owned station at Gotherington. The extension opened on the 2nd of July 1997, although the official opening ceremony by Alan Towers, a BBC Midlands Today presenter, took place 10 days later. Usually, the railway threw caution to the wind when planning their next line extension.
Then we got to Gretton and then Gotherington, and then we decided, well, we might as well make the racecourse.
When Colin Fuel joined, the line only went as far as Gotherington.
And they were at that point well on the way to actually opening through to Cheltenham Racecourse. So it was an exciting time because we saw everything beginning to move forward. And it was really quite exciting that people were learning new trades, etc., as the railway gradually extended the extra 3.5 miles.
From the 19th century to the late 1950s, most racecourses had a station nearby, and Cheltenham was no different. At Cheltenham Racecourse, the once fire-damaged shell of a now unique booking office, which was prefabricated at Swindon by the Great Western Railway, was brought back to operational status by the Cheltenham Area Group, one of the railway's local volunteer support organisations. Both platforms were falling inwards, having suffered from 100 years of exposure to pressures from the adjacent banks of the cutting and the large tree roots. But thanks to a grant, the down platform was rebuilt and extended, but the up platform was in such a precarious state that it had to be demolished. The long exit ramp from the down platform to the booking office at Cheltenham Racecourse Station was originally built for equine movements. In 1998, track was laid at Cheltenham Racecourse Station, and on the 28th of June 1998, a press launch inaugurated by Lawrence Robertson MP promoted a new share issue.
And we're very fortunate today to have Lawrence Robertson MP for Tewkesbury here to inaugurate our share push.
For the first time since 1976, a standard gauge steam locomotive stood at the racecourse station. GWR number 1450 and a brake van ran on 180 yards of temporary track. The Gotherington to Cheltenham extension incorporated yet another mainline track building technique. Continuously welded rail was used for a mile of track through Woodmancote to minimise the noise for local residents from the passing trains. A Cirsa road rail welding machine was hired in to weld the continuous rail. With continuously welded track, the gaps between the rails do not make the familiar clackety-clack sound when wheels hit the tracks. The GWR has since found that maintenance is greatly reduced, freeing up both money and volunteer time. So as the discovery coincided with improved funds, the railway has been able to purchase flat-bottom rail on concrete sleepers. Just 2 short years later, on the 30th of December 2000, the track was laid as far as Cheltenham Racecourse, and 03 class diesel shunter number D2182 hauled the first works train into platform 2 at Cheltenham Racecourse station to a champagne reception.
That's it, we're here.
The permanent way team had laid track for the full 10 miles south from Toddington. However, the line needed to be ballasted and finished, so it was not operational. Glyn Cornish joined the permanent way department in time for the Cheltenham arrival.
It was something I'd always wanted to do. I had no real interest in driving locomotives. I was more interested in the technical side and seeing the railway grow again. Having British Rail having ripped everything out, it was lovely to see track going back in.
On the 20th of February 2001, the GWR's own engine, a Hunslet 060 saddle tank shunting locomotive King George, carried a press train from Toddington to Cheltenham Racecourse on the newly connected track and became the first steam locomotive to travel to the racecourse for over 30 years. But it was another year until the track was completed. The final 8,000 tonnes of stone ballast for the 3-mile extension was placed on the track, and Balfour Beatty Rail Plant Limited provided a tamping machine as part of a training programme for their technical staff, finishing the Cheltenham extension to the highest possible standards of safety. Facilities were needed at Cheltenham Racecourse before passenger services commenced. In 2002, a new platform building complete with waiting room, toilets and the station master's office was erected.
And I joined just at the time that they were preparing to open the extension to Cheltenham. So I had the pleasure of seeing that open the full length. The Princess Royal came and opened it for us.
Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal opened Cheltenham Racecourse Station on the 7th of April 2003. Meeting Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal at Winchcombe Station, number 6960 Raveningham Hall hauled an immaculate royal train, comprising of the inspection saloon and 3 Carmin and Cream coaches, to the racecourse with HRH the Princess Royal on board to perform the official opening ceremony.
I'd only been a member here for about a year, but I still felt a great sense of satisfaction in opening a further 5 miles of track.
5 days later, on the 12th of April 2003, the first public train, hauled by Schools Class Cheltenham and especially renamed Repton, arrived at Cheltenham Racecourse Station.
Getting to the racecourse, our passenger numbers increased by 25% overnight and have stayed that way.
By the 2003 season's end, nearly 46,000 passengers had travelled the line. Signal boxes were constructed at both Cheltenham Racecourse and Gotherington during 2004. In a style inspired by the original GWR, and with appropriate heritage items, the boxes were not entirely traditional in terms of construction techniques used. Ticket sales cover the basic operating costs for the line, but it's the fundraising and income from the shop and catering services which pays for building, restoration and other work.
I started off working in the buffet car on the train, serving drinks and bacon baps and things like that. And I found that I've become more and more involved in the commercial activities of the railway.
In 2010, the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway held its biggest ever gala over 9 days to commemorate the Great Western Railway's 175th anniversary. Bringing together a dozen of the Great Western Railway's finest operational locos, the gala attracted huge crowds from across the UK and overseas, despite the railway falling victim to a natural disaster. In April 2010, just weeks before the GWR 175 event, some movement was noticed in the embankment just beyond Gotherington Halt. Caused partly by poor drainage following exceptionally cold and wet weather, the slip was also located in the exact same position as an earlier BR repair. Unnoticeable at first, the railway had wisely closed the line beyond Gotherington as a precaution. But within 3 weeks, the land had dropped by 1.5 feet, leaving the rails for the Gotherington run-round loop suspended in mid-air. This was not the first landslip on the raised embankment. Back in December 2008, the embankment closer to Cheltenham experienced some movement, although the slip did not affect the track. But in 2010, the railway faced disaster with the huge GWR 175 event fast approaching. But enterprising as ever, the GWR devised a solution that pleased casual visitors and enthusiasts alike. The railway implemented a 2-loco service between Winchcombe and Gotherington and ran public services across the Stanway Viaduct with an auto train. Local people of a certain age fondly remember the 1 or 2 coach push-pull or auto trains that ran from Cheltenham St James to Honeybourne Junction. The service was withdrawn in 1960, but was revived for the 2010 GWR 175 Gala, where an auto train hauled fare-paying passengers over the Stanway Viaduct. The Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway's special GWR 175 Gala was a resounding success in the face of extreme adversity.
You're involved in something that gives everybody a lot of pleasure. The members, the volunteers, the visiting public love it. It's a beautiful railway with beautiful countryside around, and a lot of satisfaction in putting back what British Rail ripped out.
What, as chairman, I desperately need is more volunteers, and that's probably the biggest challenge we face. We have a tremendous group of volunteers, but 2 things. One, some of them are getting older, and the second one is some are not able to give as much time as they would like. So we're looking for people with every skill you can imagine.
And as we grow, we need more people. And there are a huge number of jobs that aren't seen. There are people who work in the shop, there are people that work in the catering, they work as guards, they work clearing the whole track bed. We do that with volunteers, and they're unsung, they're unpraised. But without them, we couldn't run.
You're working with a team, and everyone comes here with that purpose to achieve something and go away satisfied. And of course, the, shall I say, fare-paying passengers appreciate whatever you're doing, and this is why we're called the friendly line.
It's in me blood. I've been coming that long, and the wife keeps saying, "When are you packing up? You said you were packing up last year. You're still there, ain't you?" I said, "Well, you know, I'll give it another year and another year."
One group of volunteers quietly getting on with the job and usually out of public view is the highly committed group that makes up the Permanent Way team, upon whose efforts, quite literally, the GWR's operation depends. They are the Permanent Way Department who have since December 2005 been slowly taking the northernmost railhead ever closer towards one of the most visited and picturesque Cotswolds villages of Broadway. The installation of a long-awaited new bridge at Laverton in 2009 brings the prospect of reaching Broadway ever closer, and soon visitors will experience another part of the extension northwards.
We are laying track up to Laverton, where we will install a run-round loop and hopefully get that approved by the railway inspector and start running trains possibly next year.
We should reach Broadway in probably 2012 or 2013. At the moment there's nothing there apart from a big clear site that we've already cleared. A station needs to be built there, and the signalling and signal box and all the other infrastructure needs to be built there.
Once the Gloucestershire Warwickshire Railway reaches Broadway, the line will be 15 miles long. But unlike many heritage railways, there remains potential to continue even further.
Well, we're working, funny enough, on a vision to 2020. And that vision, I think, is on a couple of levels. The first of all, in terms of providing an exciting experience for visitors. We face quite a challenge insofar as at the moment 70,000 people a year ride on the railway, and obviously those 70,000 don't come back automatically. The second thing is we've got to achieve what may well be the ultimate of our ambition. The idea was to open as much of the track between Cheltenham Racecourse and Stratford-upon-Avon as possible.
The Gloucestershire and Warwickshire Railway's army of loyal volunteers have been forced to overcome some major hurdles during the course of rebuilding and operating the line, and they've never been daunted by the often immense tasks ahead of them.
I mean, I'm incredibly impressed by the way the railway's grown. I think we've been incredibly lucky. We've also had the right combination of people, and we've been in the right place at the right time, as I said before.
And the last word must go to Malcolm Temple.
We've got to remember in this country, if we don't preserve what there was, then there are no benchmarks for the future. And steam transport in this country was so vital. It made much of the prosperity we see around us. We can't let it go, and we here won't, and all our partner Heritage Railways won't as well.